In this theory is on the Western transition to capitalism. The 13th to 15th centuries were marked by a time known as the crisis of feudalism, where tensions between the landowning and peasant classes came to a head. The crisis of feudalism also involves, generally speaking, lower crop production, lower production and income per capita among the working class, but also a growing working class. So the crisis of feudalism refers to a time period at which it seemed that feudalism would no longer be able to accommodate all of its people or provide for all of the people in the economy. There are two kind of competing theories, or the general literature, on how the West transitioned into capital. Follows a pattern of either capitalism grew kind of out of feudalism from within the same structure, or capitalism grew alongside feudalism and then eventually overtook, but they started out kind of as separate structures. So these two notes right here kind of indicate each of those views. Wallerstein says, feudalism and capitalism were at odds. The ceaseless accumulation of capital permits new persons to challenge existing powers. So this is sort of an argument that capitalism grew alongside feudalism and then eventually overtook. But we also observe that governments in the 15th to 17th centuries pursued strategies which favored capitalists rather than feudal solutions to the crisis, meaning that there may be some evidence that capitalism grew from kind of within the system of feudalism. We see two papers or two arguments that take sort of institutional approaches to this question. The first is Moore, who argues essentially that the crisis of feudalism was a crisis of agriculture and of public health, kind of spurred on by the bubonic plague. And then we'll see a second view from Brenner, who argues essentially that the transition to capitalism simply perpetuated some of the same power structures that existed in feudalism. So the Moore argument, the agricultural argument, Moore notes that the structure of feudalism simultaneously discouraged investment. The gains would have been extracted by lords and landowners, but also encouraged population growth and land use, because the increasing size and demands of the ruling class over time require more workers, creating more stuff, more rents to extract. So Moore notes that during this time period, about the 13th to 15th century, crop yields in Europe, especially Western Europe and Northern Europe, declined by as much as a third to half. So you again see this crisis of feudalism, which is decreasing crops, decreasing land yields. Moore notes that there's this sort of downward cycle that occurs where, because you don't have very good crop yields, you don't have enough grain to feed animals and livestock who produce more manure and, of course, food, meat for people. And with less livestock, next year you have less manure, less crops, and then you have less crops to feed animals and so on. So overall, Moore argues that we have this long period of poor investment into public health, diminishing land quality and productivity, the farming techniques, poor investment into farming techniques and crop rotation over time degrades the land. So you can combine that with population growth, and this results in a period of famine and poor sanitation, poor education. The bubonic plague reduced the European population by a third or more, up to half in some areas. And so Moore argues that widespread systems of commodity exchange and international trade between Europe and Asia, combined with the rebalancing of land in the bubonic plague, resulted in this power shift, balancing power in favor of the masses and in favor of the traders, in favor of widespread trade in general. Moore also notes that Eastern Europe lagged for a number of reasons: inability to defend itself, spread out city-states, so on. So over time, the argument here is that because of the plague conditions, ultimately the land to labor ratio rebalanced, wages rose, land was more plentiful, trade became more common, and that transitioned us into capitalism. A sort of alternative argument is that the diminishing productivity and population or increasing population posed a threat to class relations. This was the crisis of feudalism, but could not itself determine the system that would follow it. Instead, basically, Brenner is going to argue that the system that would follow it, capitalism, in the early stages and perhaps into the later stages, simply perpetuated some of the power imbalances that existed under feudalism. So Brenner notes that the development of towns and trade in the countryside were shaped, but in a large part by the system of needs of the feudal organization. Brenner gives the example of a region of France which was heavily reliant on the wool industry. You also see in some of these command economies in the Soviet Union, the development of sort of industry towns or factory towns where most people who live at the town and have jobs work in that industry or in that factory in some way. So Brenner argues that historically, we see that the development of trade and industry, which ultimately results in the development of capitalism, was highly related to the needs of the feudal organization. Brenner also notes that there were at this time a lot of different rules for trade, values, currency. France was notorious for having different standards of production in different regions that one had to adhere to, and it would have been illegal to sell if you weren't adhering to the standards of that region. So Brenner argues that the people who were most successful were usually people who were in alliance with the feudal lords and would have had a good knowledge of the laws and maybe even an influence on the laws and the trade in the land. One notable example of this would be perhaps the East India Trading Company and their affiliation with the British Crown. So overall, taken in combination, all of the arguments kind of put together, the base argument and then the agricultural and the power structure arguments, overall, the incentives seem to have aligned for the existing feudal class and the blossoming capitalist class to pursue external rather than internal solutions to the crisis of land and resource use. It is a potential explanation for the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, the feudal lords having trouble controlling the masses. We see a lot of peasant uprising. So the ownership class is looking for a way to keep wages low or keep a kind of working class subsistence base. We see during this time period a number of wars, conflicts, and revolutions combined with the mass death, which generally reduced the holdings of the landowner class and reallocated some resources into the capitalist class. Ultimately, during this time period, we see a cultural shift towards private property ownership and away from kind of common lands owned by the ruling class, but it's not exactly clear culturally how this shift would have occurred. So I've left that as a kind of interesting paper topic. You know, how was it that as a people or as a society, most societies seem to have transitioned during this time towards even the working class owning some sort of meager private property. All right, so in the next video, we'll finish up with a short section on the marginalists, and then I'll post a review.